Welcome to The F Word, a podcast series that examines, excavates, unpicks and reframes forgiveness through the lives of others. I'm Marina Cantacuzino, a journalist from London, founder of the Forgiveness Project charity, and I've built my career investigating how those who face the most complex and devastating things in life find a way through. Each episode, I'll be talking to a guest who's experienced something very difficult or traumatic in their life, but who, rather than respond with hate or bitterness, has embraced, or at the very least considered, forgiveness as a response to pain. My guest today is Arno Michaelis. Arno is an American from Wisconsin, a former skinhead who was the founder of one of the largest racist skinhead organizations in the world, and who spent years of his life committing terrible acts in the name of white power. But then his life changed dramatically when he did an almost complete about-turn, becoming a champion for compassion and understanding as he forged a life after hate. In 2012, Arno met and started working with Pardeep Kaleka, whose father had been recently murdered when a white supremacist shot and killed 6 people in a Sikh temple in Wisconsin. Arno and Pardeep have since formed a deep friendship. They've written a book together called Gift of Our Wounds and co-founded the organisation Serve to Unite, which works with students to create inclusive, compassionate and non-violent communities. And, by the way, Pardeep is also a guest on another episode of the F Word podcast. So hello Arno, it's wonderful to speak to you today on the F Word podcast. Just wondering where you're speaking to me from?
Thank you, Marina. Yeah, I'm here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the United States, and it's a delight to be on the podcast.
Arno, I'm going to ask you something that you are asked often, and I hope you don't mind going into it again. But I'm just interested in what drew you to the white power movement, and how do you learn to hate people? Is it something that comes from your upbringing, or was it a reaction against something? Can you pinpoint anything in your childhood or teenage years that actually made you decide to take that path?
So the simple answer is that hurt people. Even though I had a fairly idyllic childhood compared to billions of children on this planet, I grew up in a nice house, nice neighborhood. My parents were together. They both loved me very much. My father's alcoholism made life really difficult for my mom, and growing up seeing my mother suffer, I started lashing out at other kids and developed a habit for it, so that I became like addicted to the stimulation of causing trouble. And very much like substance abuse, the amount of substance that gets you high the first time doesn't get you high 10 times later, so you need to keep escalating it. So I went from being a bully on the school bus to fights in the schoolyard to breaking and entering to vandalism. I started drinking myself when I was 14. By the time I'm 16, I'm a full-blown alcoholic. I've been violent since I was a little kid. I have an addiction to causing trouble and repulsing civil society. And that's when I was introduced to white nationalist ideology through white power skinhead music. But it was really arbitrary, and it certainly wasn't from my upbringing. Neither of my parents were racist. That wasn't taught to me. It was attractive because in the late 1980s, it was so shunned by society. It very much seemed to be a counter of the status quo. And if someone could have convinced me the status quo was white supremacy and fascism, I could have just as easily became a so-called anti-fascist. The flavor of violent extremism was completely arbitrary. That's just the one that I happened to be introduced to and I happened to gravitate to in the late 1980s.
And what kind of violence would you get into? Was it like being part of a gang? Was it a sense of belonging? Was it very random? Clearly it escalated.
At the beginning, it was very akin to a common street gang. I was really just a drunken hooligan looking for validation for the violence I was already engaging in. But the more I delved into the ideology of white nationalism, the more the violence picked up this romantic cast of I'm a white warrior fighting for the future and the survival of my race. And the more that narrative took hold, I think the more vicious the violence became. And the violence we perpetrated was we would just get drunk and go out in the city and attack people at random. There were times when we attacked people because of their skin color or because we thought they were gay or we thought they were Jewish. But more often than that, we just attacked Joe Average white guy and afterwards spin it to say that he was a race traitor, which is the highest order of enemy for a white nationalist.
How long did that last, Arno, being part of the movement? And at what point did it feel like it wasn't the right path for you?
I was involved in white nationalist hate groups for 7 years, from 1987 to 1994. And right from the beginning, I knew what I was doing was wrong. That was part of the exhaustion that built for 7 years to bring me to a point where I was finally looking for an excuse to leave. But in the same way that a heroin addict knows it's wrong to not only do heroin, but steal to support their habit or even prostitute themselves, they don't care as long as they're getting that fix. And that's how I was. I knew it was wrong to hurt people and to hate people and to fly swastikas around in people's faces, but I didn't care because it gave me that rush that I was looking for in the same way any other junkie would chase a high. The big factor in leaving was exhaustion, and the exhaustion came from that knowledge of my wrongness, but it also came from all these things that happened in my life that contradicted the narrative I was trying to adopt as my identity. That narrative being that, first of all, race is a thing and that I'm a different race than other people according to the color of my skin, and that makes me different than everyone else and superior to everyone else and at war with everyone else. And I would meet people like a Jewish boss or a lesbian supervisor or Black and Latino coworkers who treated me with kindness when I least deserved it and defied the hostility that I was constantly trying to cultivate. And every time that happened, it really drove home how wrong I was, to the point where I finally became so exhausted that I was looking for an excuse to leave. And that happened in 1994 when my girlfriend and I broke up. Our daughter was 18 months old. And a couple months after that, a second friend of mine was murdered in a street fight after a concert my band had played. And at that point, I had lost count how many friends had been incarcerated. So it hit me that if I didn't leave, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter.
So, Arno, as you came out of the movement, which I think must have been a very courageous thing to do, you clearly started to reflect on all the damage you'd done. So I'm wondering, of course, where does forgiveness fit into your story?
I always remember, Marina, when you and I first met, and you had asked me to become part of the Forgiveness Project. And I was very intimidated, for one. I had also just met people who had just been through the most horrific trauma you could imagine, losing parts of their body in a terrorist attack or having a parent or a child murdered in violent extremist attacks. And I didn't feel worthy to be among them, for one. And I also felt like nobody did anything to me. There's no one I need to forgive. And you pointed out that the people who showed me kindness really had to forgive me on the spot in order to do so. And that more importantly, that journey of self-forgiveness is really a poignant one.
And in terms of sort of facing your past head on, really, have you thought about how to make amends? Have you thought about what self-forgiveness does mean for you?
My main driver for self-forgiveness is that if I'm hating myself for the harm that I've done, I'm not going to be able to help other people stay out of hate groups. I'm not going to be able to help other people get out of hate groups. I'm not going to be able to help people along the same path that I've taken. So to me, it's a very tactical process. And it by no means even implies that the harm that I've done is okay or that it's forgiven or that it's off the table. I'm going to carry the harm that I've done to my grave, and I should. But if I let that harm continue to harm me, I don't believe that I'm honoring my victims. I think the way to honor the people that I've hurt and the people who are hurt by broken white kids that I set loose on society is to fix broken white kids and give them a lesson that there's a better way to live their lives. And I can't do that if I'm beating myself up.
I just want to share here a piece of recording that I made with Arno a few years ago when he was in London and we were doing some events around violent extremism, including a talk in the East London Mosque. This recording is interesting to me because he goes into a little more depth about forgiveness and love and self-forgiveness.
When I think about how forgiveness has transformed my life and why it's something worth pursuing, it's important to think about, in the simplest terms, what do I want in life? And actually, I want what everybody else wants in life. I want to be happy, and I want to be successful. And in many ways, that translates for us human beings into, I want to experience love. I want to experience love for myself and love for other human beings. And in my experience, it's not possible to experience love without forgiveness. If you are attached to some harm that was either done to you or that you've done to someone else, you carry that harm with you everywhere you go. And bearing that burden, you just logically can never be happy. How can you be happy when you're experiencing trauma over and over and over again? And forgiveness allows us to detach from the trauma. You always have the experience of going through it or of causing it, but you can't really reach a point where you're not hurting other people and you're not hurting yourself without just kind of acknowledging the trauma and saying, yeah, that happened. I'm going to learn from it. I'm going to move on, and I'm going to try to bring about a world where that trauma is less likely to happen. When you can reach that point, those are the types of experiences that bring true happiness into our life.
And there is one other thing that Arno has said about forgiveness, which I actually often quote, because I think it shows brilliantly how unconditional forgiveness doesn't only serve the person forgiving, but can actually bring about a dramatic and unexpected change in those being forgiven too. Arno said, "Forgiveness is a sublime example of humanity that I explore at every opportunity, because it was the unconditional forgiveness I was given by people who I once claimed to hate that demonstrated the way from there to here." Anyway, in the podcast, I then went on to ask Arno about a specific example of the kind of unconditional forgiveness shown to him. Can you just describe what happened in the McDonald's? You went to McDonald's once, this woman saw the tattoos you had. I think it's a very pertinent story, actually. It says a lot.
Yeah, so early on in the 7-year process, I was trying to adopt this toxic, violent, extremist ideology as my identity, which meant that I had to hate black people on sight. And it was very difficult to do that in many situations, especially when people greeted me with a smile and kind of showed me their humanity. And there was an incident where I went to McDonald's every payday to get a Big Mac, and the McDonald's I went to, there was an elderly black woman working there behind the counter, and she had this presence about her where she had this beaming smile that was kind of like the sun. It just shone for everybody. It didn't care who you were, what your background was. The smile was just there, and it was very powerful, and it made it very difficult for me to hate her on sight. And that alone made me uncomfortable. But a couple times returning to this McDonald's, she saw a swastika I had tattooed on my middle finger in my right hand. And she said, "What is that on your finger?" In the same way my grandma would scold me when I was beating up my little brother. And rather than say, "It's a swastika because I'm a white warrior fighting for my people, you savage mongrel, mud race, blah, blah, blah," like we would talk amongst ourselves. Instead of saying all that, I just looked down at my steel-toed skinhead boots and said, "It's nothing." And she waited till I looked up again, and she said, "I think you're a better person than that. That's not who you are." That was an incredible act of bravery on her part, but also it was an incredible act of power. In taking that approach with me, she was putting herself in a position of power, in a position that ultimately changed the course of my life. It was a big part of that growing exhaustion. Just to be clear about things, at this point I had a shaved head. At that time in particular, I had a 2-inch gash in my forehead from being hit with a lead pipe of stitches. I had swastikas tattooed on me. I had a swastika on my jacket. Like, there's no mistaking who I was and what I was about. And she would have been completely righteous had she said, "Get out of my store, you racist bastard." She would have had every right to do so, but had she done so, she would have validated everything I was trying to believe rather than contradicted it. And so by seeing the humanity in me, which she had to forgive me for in order to do, she blew holes in this whole house of cards that I was trying to construct as my identity. And that, to me, is power. That's defiance. I think that's a really important thing to think about in today's society.
Okay, I just want to share here something Arno said to me once, which really explained to me extremist thinking. He was describing the extreme views he once held as being as fragile as a house of cards, and therefore needing to be protected by the armour of certainty. And I love that expression, the armour of certainty, and this idea that such strong views are actually so fragile. And Arno said that when he took the armour off, it was incredible because it took him to a whole new level of connecting with fellow human beings. As he said to me, being suddenly vulnerable, I could now connect with the vulnerability of others. So Arno then spoke about the whole concept of making amends having been stripped of the armour of certainty. And is there an element there of atoning for your history of violence and hatred by helping others come out of the movement?
Yeah, there certainly was at first. I've been doing this for 11 years. I went public with my story in 2010. And when I started, there was very much kind of an atonement cast to it. But nowadays, I do it for its own sake. I think it's more powerful in that way. I'm more present and it's more genuine if I'm helping people for the sheer joy and purpose of serving others rather than trying to right some wrong. I'm a Buddhist nowadays, so moment is where we all live. And while the past shapes us and our experience is always going to be part of us, we do have a choice as to whether or not we want to let it define our future and define the moment we're living in.
And tell me, Arno, how you came to meet Pardeep, how you came to write a book with him, how you came to work in Serve to Unite with him. How did that come about?
I went public with my story early 2010, and by August 5th, 2012, I had built a bit of a platform as the former white supremacist guy, done a bit of media. I had already done a couple hundred speaking engagements by then. And after the attack that happened on August 5th, 2012, the following day I was piled on by media from all over the world to get my perspective on this horrific attack. And I really felt an obligation to talk about how important compassion is. And first and foremost, that we as a society have compassion for people who have been the targets of hate. But secondly, to point out that compassion is the answer to hate. I really think that the definition of hate is a willful denial of compassion. So if we see someone's behavior and you say, I don't care what happens to that person, in fact, I hope they suffer for their actions, that's hate as far as I'm concerned. And so compassion is the answer when we can see someone being hateful and understand that they're doing so because they're hurting and because they've been through trauma that hasn't been processed in a healthy way. That is the process of compassion. And so I spoke a lot about that in the media that I'd done.
So I'm going to play here another part of the 2016 recording that I made with Arno, because I think it's interesting what he says publicly about hate speech and the big debate about whether hate speech should be shut down and censored.
I'm personally very opposed to laws against hate speech. I think they're incredibly counterproductive. I know as a former white supremacist that had we laws like that in the United States, we would have made all kinds of hay from it saying, see, they're afraid of what we have to say. The government's afraid of us and they're trying to shut us down, and now we're victims. Now we're being persecuted. We're being oppressed just for speaking our mind, just for having our thoughts. So it tends to fuel the hate speech much more than suppress it. And the hate speech happens one way or another. You can't outlaw racism. You can't outlaw hate. These are emotional and mental processes that need to be dealt with as you deal with any other mental or emotional malfunction, to deal with it from a healing standpoint rather than a law enforcement standpoint. That being said, if we can cultivate a culture where healing is a practice and where compassion is a practice, kindness is a practice, that's going to make a society that's less conducive for hate speech to happen.
Anyway, I then went on to ask Arno how he came to meet Pardeep Kaleka, whose father had been murdered by a white supremacist. So Arno, you'd heard about the shootings at the Sikh temple. You had been asked all sorts of questions about it, partly because I believe the shooter, Wade Michael Page, had been part of the racist skinhead group you co-founded. But when did you actually come to meet with Pardeep?
A couple months after the shooting, Pardeep reached out to me via email, and we emailed back and forth. We exchanged phone numbers. We made arrangements to meet for dinner. And when we sat down for dinner, we talked for 4 hours. And we talked about our daughters and our fathers and our lives. And we touched on the shooting and white nationalism and things like that. But it really was kind of just almost in passing in our conversation. And I think that's really something powerful to contemplate, is that, well, we were brought together by this horrific hate crime. Our relationship is a lot more than that. And I think that's a model for society, in that, yes, race and racism are still causing massive suffering on this planet, and they have for 5 centuries, but there's more to life than that. And in order to truly overcome and heal, we need to see the goodness of our day-to-day life and connect in those places. And I think that's the best medicine, to create an environment that's not conducive to hate and separatism.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that, Arno. I always love hearing what you have to say about what draws people into hate, and even more importantly, what gets them out. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, likewise, Marina. I miss you guys, and I cannot wait to get back across the pond.
Thank you for listening to the F Word podcast. To dig a bit deeper around some of the themes we've talked about, do check out the show notes by going to theforgivenessproject.com/FWordPodcast. And from there you can also explore the Forgiveness Project website, which over the years has collected and shared many more stories of how people have transformed the darkest of situations. I also want to invite you to join the F Word Podcast Facebook group, especially if you have more to discuss or share. Again, to find the link, go to theforgivenessproject.com/FWordPodcast. But most of all, I hope you'll join me again